Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Welcome to the third session of Dua and Chill with Believers Bail Out. I am Camila, part of the National Leads crew of the BBO Collective, and on behalf of all of the folks who spend so freely of themselves to grow our community, thank you for spending some time with us tonight.
Yes, and I am Miriam, also from the National Leads crew, hailing from Central Illinois right now hailing from San Francisco by way of Central Illinois, to be exact. Thank you and welcome us to your space.
Alhamdulillah. So we have super exciting stuff happening tonight. It seems like each week it just gets better and better. So thank you all for joining us. We are going to show a quick clip of a BBO video. We have a sister who's going to join us and open with a dua, inshallah. We have Brother Bilal who is going to recite for us. And we're going to have a scholar cipher, which is going to be awesome, inshallah. So I'm going to start with the video. Bismillah.
Millions of people in the U.S. are incarcerated simply because they can't afford to be free. Money bond forces people to pay for freedom, or languish in cages, awaiting trials or immigration hearings. The majority of this burden falls on Black people, who are given higher bond amounts, and women, who are less likely to be able to pay any bound amount. This past year, money bond has also locked folks in cages with a deadly disease, COVID. Cages are never healthy places. But now, not only do folks have to fight for their freedom, they must also fight an often losing battle for their health.
Without access to soap, clean water, mask, or social distancing, prisons and jails have become sites of mass contamination. Our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated have been abandoned by the system, but not by their communities. New folks are joining the call for prison abolition, and we will celebrate every win and every person freed. Now in our fourth year, Believers Bail Out has used the zakat and sadaqah funds entrusted to us to provide bail relief to 59 Muslims and other types of support to hundreds more. Communities are powerful. We keep us safe and we will get us free. Join us. Bismillah. And throughout our time tonight, we will have opportunities for you to check out our LaunchGo page, inshallah. And we appreciate the faith that our community has had in us so far to entrust us with your zakat and sadaqah funds. And so we'd appreciate it this year too, inshallah. So next we're gonna have a recitation of Qur'an by Bilal, who is a senior at Harvard University studying psychology. He is passionate about mental health equity, samesies, and interfaith work. And outside of the class, he enjoys reading, biking, and vibing. Assalamu alaikum, Bilal.
Wa alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone.
Floor is all yours.
Appreciate it. So excited to join you all tonight. Inshallah, tonight we'll be reciting from Surah Al-Baqarah, first verse 177, and then a few more verses from Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 261 to 265. So I'll begin with the Arabic and then go ahead and read the English translation. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة وآتى الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون. Righteousness is not in turning your faces toward the east or the west. Rather, the righteous are those who believe in Allah, the last day, the angels, the books, and the prophets, who give charity out of their cherished wealth to relatives, orphans, the poor, the needy travelers, the beggars, and for freeing captives, who establish prayer, pay alms tax, and keep the pledges that they make, and who are patient in times of suffering, in times of adversity, and in the heat of battle. It is they who are true in faith, and it is they who are mindful of Allah. مثل الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله كمثل حبة أنبتت 7 سنابل في كل سنبلة 100 حبة والله يضاعف لمن يشاء والله واسع عليم. الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله ثم لا يتبعون ما أنفقوا منا ولا أذى لهم أجرهم عند ربهم ولا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. قول معروف ومغفرة خير من صدقة يتبعها أذى والله غني حليم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تبطلوا صدقاتكم بالمن والأذى كالذي ينفق ماله رئاء الناس ولا يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فمثله كمثل صفوان عليه تراب فأصابه وابل فتركه صلدا لا يقدرون على شيء مما كسبوا والله لا يهدي القوم الكافرين. ومثل الذين ينفقون أموالهم ابتغاء مرضات الله وتثبيتا من أنفسهم كمثل جنة بربوة أصابها وابل فآتت أكلها ضعفين فإن لم يصبها وابل فطل والله بما تعملون بصير. The example of those who spend their wealth in the cause of Allah is that of a grain that sprouts into 7 ears, each bearing 100 grains, and Allah multiplies the reward even more to whoever He wills, for Allah is all bountiful, all-knowing. Those who spend their wealth in the cause of Allah and do not follow their charity with reminders of their generosity or with hurtful words, they will get their reward from their Lord, and there will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve. Kind words and forgiveness are better than charity followed by injury, and Allah is self-sufficient, most forbearing. O believers, do not waste your charity with reminders of your generosity or hurtful words, like those who donate their wealth just to show off, and those who do not believe in Allah or the last day. Their example is that of a hard, barren rock covered with a thin layer of soil, hit by a strong rain, leaving it just a bare stone. Such people are unable to preserve the reward of their charity. Allah does not guide such disbelieving people. And the example of those who donate their wealth, seeking Allah's pleasure, and believing the reward is certain, is that of a garden on a fertile hill. When heavy rain falls, it yields up to twice its normal produce. If no heavy rain falls, the drizzle is sufficient, and Allah is all-seeing of what you do. With that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Sister Kamila. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alhamdulillah. Sadaqallahu al-azim. Thank you very much for that. And now we are going to be joined by our sister, Hazel Gomez, who is going to lead us in dua, inshallah. So, Hazel.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Alhamdulillah. I'm so honored to be here for this Dua and Chill program. I'm also one of the national leads with Believers Bail Out. And alhamdulillah to be here with each and every one of you and having heard that beautiful recitation from Brother Bilal. As I start, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. So one of the things that really stood out to me as I was preparing for tonight was that last night and today until Maghrib, we are in this night of and this day of the 17th of Ramadan. And so 1440 Hijri years ago was when the Battle of Badr occurred. And to the human, right, this was a conflict that just by looking at it, just with using our own senses, we would have immediately assumed that based on the sheer numbers of the Muslims and based on the numbers of the Quraysh, we would have thought that those 313 or so Muslims were going to lose to that army of over 1,000 by the Quraysh. But it was only because God can make miracles happen, that what really happened was that the Muslims completely defeated the Quraysh. And Allah reminds us in Surah Al-Anfal in verse 9, where he says, when you begged your Lord for help, he answered you. I will reinforce you with 1,000 angels in succession. So imagine on this night where the Muslims are feeling a little helpless, where we're small in numbers, but the angels are filling up the sky and they're coming to help the Muslims defeat this army that is 3 times more than the number of people that are there, than the number of Muslims that are there. And even though there are countless lessons that we can take from the Battle of Badr, one of the things that really stood out to me as we begin this night of dua and Qur'an and being in community with one another is really the power of dua, and coupling that with the importance of really believing with all of our might that Allah will answer us, even if something seems completely impossible to human rationality. But to Allah, anything is possible, including defunding the police and refunding the people, including defunding the prison industrial complex. And so with that, I'd like to read a few lines from the prayer of the oppressed. It is a prayer that was written in the 16th century. It is a bit longer and very heavy in certain parts, but these are the share each and every one of you, inshallah. If you're interested, this is what the book looks like. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. O infinite in beauty, whose endless good befalls the creatures you have made, so answer all our calls. You alone save drowning souls, so gracious with our states, rescuing the doomed, relieving our dire straits. Constriction is increasing, there is no cure in sight. So hasten to our needs, respond to set them right. Our hands are raised to you, our palms are open wide. We seek sincerely endless grace you do provide. Be gentle with our souls in all you have decreed. Bestow on us what pleases you in what we need. Replace our state of hardship with your gentle ease. and guide us with your power's prevailing breeze. And place our status over those who took our lands, constrain their evil now, and tightly bind their hands. Overcome our foes with your subduing might. Unravel all their hopes and force them to take flight. Deter their evil aims and dash their unjust plan. Repel them from our gates and mystify each man. Be swift in justice, Lord, in this our anxious hour, for they cannot remove an atom of your power. O Lord, by holding on to your most gracious rope, we bind it to our faith and knot it to our hope. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. What I loved about these particular lines of that dua is it reminds us of Allah's might, but it reminds us again that the dua of the oppressed are always answered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as I mentioned, please take a read of the full prayer, and it can be a lot heavier on some parts. But I would like to end on a more hopeful note. If your heart is racing, may Allah bring ease. I want to end on a more hopeful note, and this beautiful, beautiful dua, this beautiful prayer that the Prophet ﷺ would make at least five times a day. And it's the prayer of light. And as believers, as we are navigating the muck of this dunya, and as we are sitting today, 1440 Hijri years after this battle of Badr, where the Muslims thought they were going to be defeated, and Allah brought this beautiful, beautiful beings of light to help defeat the oppressors. And this prayer of light, I will read it now. Bismillah. Ya Allah, you are light, and from you is light. Place light in my heart, and on my tongue, and in my eyes, and in my ears, and in front of me, and to the right of me, and to the left of me, and behind me, and in my presence. Place light in my nerves, and in my bones, and in my flesh. Make me live in light. Grant me light. Give me light. Make me light. And make all of us light. Ameen, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward to hearing this beautiful conversation that we're about to have, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sister, how are you?
I'm good, alhamdulillah. How are you?
Good. I'm Ramadan Mubarak. I'm just trying to overcome I was getting choked up a little bit with Sister Hazel's the dua of the oppressed that she shared. Yeah, I'm good, mashallah. I'm good. I'm ready to go.
We made it. You made it to Thursday evening.
Alhamdulillah.
I asked the team to queue up a few verses from the chapter about the Battle of Badr, and Al-Anfal. Just because I remember when I was reading this a week or two ago, I was really struck by what is said here. So I'll read this version that's on the screen. If they incline to peace, incline you as well to it, and trust in Allah. Surely He is all-hearing, all-knowing. And should they seek to deceive you, Allah is sufficient for you. He it is who strengthened you with His succor and the believers, and joined their hearts. Had you given away all the riches of the earth, you could not have joined their hearts. But it is Allah who joined their hearts. Indeed, He is almighty, all-wise. O Prophet, Allah is sufficient for you and the believers who follow you. O Prophet, rouse the believers to fighting. If they be 20 of you who persevere, they shall vanquish 200. And if there be of you 100, they shall vanquish 1,000 of those who disbelieve, for they are a people who lack understanding. And can we get one more? Allah has now lightened your burden, for he found weakness in you. So if there be 100 of you who persevere, they shall vanquish 200. And if there be 1,000 of you, they shall, by the leave of Allah, vanquish 2,000. Allah is with those who persevere. And when I think of the persevere, it can also be patient and steadfast. And when I read these verses, in the translation I was reading, is Allah is enough, right? Allah is sufficient, right? And that was just, it really hit me, right? In terms of thinking about, especially when we do sort of social justice work and are doing this work, in the struggle, in the big jihad, and I'm constantly struck. We get frustrated with our people who aren't rousing up with us, or we're frustrated with ourselves. We're frustrated with and enraged by our political leaders, and just to be reminded that Allah is sufficient, right? And Allah is the one that brings the hearts together. We fight for justice. I just wanted to think back on those verses. I don't know your thoughts, Yusuf.
Yeah, definitely. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when I listen to those verses, and I also have some thoughts about the dua of light that Sister Hazel recited earlier, that is still sort of milling around in my heart. But it makes me think of how Allah tells us that he is sufficient for us, but also makes me think of our faith in Allah that should be sufficient, right? And so it's not merely that one is willing to enter the battlefield. One is willing to enter the struggle, to move in the direction of social justice, to expand the good and prohibit evil. But one does so faithfully. One does so with the understanding that Allah is there, that when we move our hands and our feet, right, it's to benefit us, right? Because Allah is going to transform society in whichever way Allah wants to, in whichever way Allah wills. That question of faith, right, animates and motivates the soul to incline toward Allah, to incline toward taqwa, God consciousness, and surely a concern for justice being a part of that. So, and then also, just going back to this sort of question of praying for light, and the presence of light in us, on us, in front of us, behind us, and on our sides, and on our side, right? It makes me think of the process and the struggle of helping others to see the light, right? Particularly in the context that we're talking about, so that others can have access to light. Those that are in bondage and caged in darkness. So I don't know, those two components were sort of, milling around in my head and in my heart, as Sister Hazel was sharing those dua. So.
Yeah, I think those are nice, really beautiful reflections. Also, it's sometimes I find that it is those who are incarcerated who are also our light, right? For us, right? Who are out here, that sometimes we're the ones in darkness. And I know last week, one of the sisters was talking about this in terms of how we forget, right? Trying to forget those who are incarcerated, those who may be more vulnerable than ourselves, right? Even if we think of ourselves as being kind of vulnerable, that we forget, and so that we never actually know where the light is going to come from. I mean, it comes from Allah, but in terms of how it will be presented to us, right? And I think that's something I've been learning through this work as well.
Yeah. So I have a Believers Bail Out has posted bond for 60 believers since 2018. MashaAllah, alhamdulillah. I wanted to shout that out. And may Allah increase this effort and allow us to participate in the freeing of believers and human beings, period, so that one day we may abolish a systemic dehumanization of human beings and of Muslims in this context. I wanted to start. I was wondering if we could sort of start at a basic fundamental question, right? Because I make the assumption that there are people who have returned to this dua and chill space, but that there are also first timers, right? Who may or may not have, I guess, a sharp awareness of what BBO is trying to achieve, but also why it's trying to achieve it. So I was wondering if we could ask, what does fighting cash bail have to do with Islam and Muslims in America? And I have my own thoughts, but I was wondering if you could sort of lead us in that.
Yeah, I can. Well, I think one of the things is that we have a structure, right, of zakat, right, that that is used to purify our wealth, that I think is really about a structure of redistributing the resources and handling some of the material inequality that we find in our society, right? And when we think of the structure of the prison industrial complex, right, how it informs our lives, how it shapes the world well beyond like the actual physical places, the jails and the prisons, that it's actually in so much of our geography, right? Both in terms of what gets abandoned or neglected because of the money that goes into paying for those jails and prisons and policing and everything that in courts and everything that goes into it, which means that other things aren't being provided for, right? So schools that are defunded are part of the prison industrial complex, right?
Yeah.
And so when, you know, Keisha, May, and so I got together and invited me in to think about, well, how do Muslims respond? How do Muslims participate in the practices of abolition that we were seeing? Zakat seemed like a really good reason or a good way to approach that. And, you know, of course, we all know about giving money to those who are poor, the masakin and the needy, and those who distribute zakat, the traveler, those with debts. But that one of those categories is also freeing those who are captive or in bondage, right?
Yeah.
And how often were people doing that with their zakat in the 21st century, right? And, you know, if we want to do everything that Allah asks us to do in the Qur'an, that's one of those things, right? And the community is responsible to make sure that is happening. And so, you know, well, let's try it, right? Let's see if people will give their zakat to bail folks out, right? Because money bail is a form of bondage, right? You are put into jail after you've been arrested and given a bond amount, right? And if you can pay that bond, you're released, right? But if you can't pay it, you're incarcerated, right? While you're fighting a case, while you're determining your innocence or guilt, right? And so, and it's oftentimes a real like on-ramp, right, into being sort of caught up in the system and potentially getting a record, which, you know, it's just like a rolling thing of how it will affect your life afterwards. And we also know a lot of people who the court system is actually made so that people will plead guilty because it couldn't actually handle bringing every case to trial, right? So it's an inherently unjust system, you know, and in the words of the Quran, it's a corruption, right? It's a corruption of our society. And so this is why we are using zakat to get people free, right? To get them out. It's not only the, you know, and it falls under so many categories. Like, I'm stunned sometimes when I think about it. Like, it's those who are to free someone from captivity, those with debt, oftentimes poor, needy, right? In terms of the ICE detentions, you know, people who are wayfarers.
Yeah.
So, sorry, long answer.
No. I mean, you know, I think we should talk at length about this. I think we're not talking enough about it, actually. So every word that we utter in support of justice is not a word wasted. So thank you for that. I think, and just to sort of echo and underscore some of the things that you said, fighting cash bail. Cash bail is something that those people who study justice and study corruption and study injustice in this society, they agree that cash bail is problematic, that cash bail is a criminalization of poverty, right? That it overwhelmingly punishes people who do not have means, that it unfairly impacts, negatively impacts people who don't have money, right? And it renders people further more vulnerable than they otherwise would be, right?
Yeah.
And so fighting cash bail is to, as we understand it, to work toward a more equitable society, right? After all, social justice for Muslims and for people who believe in God is a moral imperative and a religious duty, right? And so in Islamic ethics, if we could speak of Islamic ethics for a second, calls for advocacy, as you said, on behalf of the economically vulnerable. And it runs directly counter to a criminalization of poverty.
Yeah.
Right. And so definitely, I agree with that. I think one of the other things that that I'm hearing, right, in your discussion about charity, right, is and something that I said that I alluded to before is God frees who He wants, right? But we should also look at it as an opportunity to participate in the process of manumission, in the process of freedom, right? Certainly, Allah could have asked Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to step onto the field of Badr by himself, supported by angels. He invited this fledgling community of Muslims to spend of their wealth, to give, to sacrifice for the sake of Islam, for the establishment of a submission to God that produces and reproduces peace and harmony, right? And a social equitable order, right? Or an equitable social order. God didn't need those excellent human beings to participate in the Battle of Badr. And certainly there were those that had the opportunity that did not take that opportunity. And they quite forcefully and quickly regretted that decision when they realized what they missed out on, right? And so I'm saying this to say that we have an opportunity to participate in freedom, in the freeing of people, in the freeing of human beings. We have the opportunity to dismantle systemic corruption. And so it seems to me that the eradication of cash bail would result from a kind of an impetus to reform, or to reform this nation's sort of carceral approach to justice, right? But cash bail reform, or calling for the eradication of cash bail, isn't necessarily, or might not necessarily be equated to abolition. So I'm wondering if we can talk for a bit about abolition and what is the distinction between abolition and reform? Because I think that those of us, you and me, and those people who are in support of a Believers Bail Out, I believe, as well as, and certainly its organizing leadership, are in favor and in support of abolitionism. Meanwhile, you have a more popular approach that's, I think, disguised as a pragmatic approach, I think, is to reform the system, right? And so I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that distinction, reform versus abolition, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, totally. I think we go in pretty clear-eyed, right, in terms of paying money bails for people. It's a harm reduction, right?
Yeah.
It's I also think of it very much as like an organizing tool as well, right? Like doing the bailout work gives us a platform to talk about it, right? To talk about the injustice inherent in it, and then to have a larger conversation about the whole, we call it the criminal justice system, but it's really a criminal punishment system, right? So it is also a really important opportunity to do the education work that we want to do, and just to, get people to recognize this and how they're implicated in it as well. But I also really love how you talked about, this is an obligation, but it's also an opportunity, right? And I think the abolition part of the work that we're doing is the building the community part and taking care of each other part, because people tend to think of abolition as something that is just about destroying things or deconstructing things and taking them down, right? But it's actually much more about building, right? It's building the world that we want to see, right? In terms of what a number of scholars have said, making the world that, where police and prisons wouldn't need to be necessary, or, or wouldn't be existing, right? And I think there's a question of whether they're necessary or not, right? And so I think, so that building community part, right, is like to rebuild those ties with those who are incarcerated, with those who are vulnerable, and really getting them free for our own freedom as well, right? To recognize that all our lives are tied together, and that if one person is suffering, the whole world is, right? And so how are we supposed to respond to that? So I really do think of like having been invited into this work as like a privilege and opportunity. So yeah, I really appreciate that framing that you gave us. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Oh no, indeed. So I'm an educator, right? And I've taken on that identity, and I've been doing the work of educating and sharing information and knowledge for the past almost 2 decades. And so I'm about to nerd out real quick, if that's okay. So
nerd.
So I'm teaching a class this semester at UNC called Ethnicity, Race, and Religion in America. And we had our last class meeting today. And so one of the things that I asked my students to read in preparation for today is a book by Joshua Doubler and Vincent Lloyd called Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons. I would implore everyone to take a look at this book. because one of the things that they do in the book is to think beyond. So I think most people have heard of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, in which she talks about how hyper incarceration, mass incarceration, right, is an iteration of a new Jim Crow order, or an extension of what was already there, right? But Joshua Doubler and Vincent Lloyd, in their book, want to take that further and want to move in the direction of an Angela Davis approach in questioning the presence of prisons altogether. And so essentially, their thesis is that the problem with incarceration is not that it is massive, right? It's not that there are too many prisoners, but the fact that it exists at all, right? And they identify, and so let me just put it bluntly, right? Because we talk about incarceration, we talk about imprisonment, and this is one of the things that struck me about this book entitled "Break Every Yoke," is they use the term, they refer to it as caging human beings, right? When we speak of caging human beings, right, I think that is rhetorically productive because it tells us, and it really gets to the heart of the fact that incarceration, that is the caging of human beings, is a moral abomination, right? And that the prison industrial complex, it's designed not to separate a kind of dangerous class of people from an innocent public, but rather it is to contribute to, it is an appendage of racial capitalism, right? Mass incarceration is not something that is threatens, upstanding, innocent white Americans, right? There is a way in which, right, the capital gains acquired through the corporation of prisons, right, falls so heavily on people of color, particularly poor people of color, right? And so we acknowledge, and should acknowledge, that as they do in this book, that there are certain sets of, and histories of, religious ideas and practices that have bolstered and informed an expansion of the carceral state, right? And called for an expansion of, and the sort of rapid building of prisons. Their intervention is to say that through our current sort of discourse about abolition and abolitionism doesn't incorporate the potential for religious discourse and practices to set us aright, to participate profoundly in a kind of popular growth of abolitionist discourse, right? And so I wanted for a second to go back to, thank you to the organizers for putting that on the screen. I've been sort of slowly reading another book. I don't want this to turn into Reading Rainbow, but maybe it should, I don't know. This is a book called The Long Emancipation, Moving Toward Black Freedom by Ronaldo Walcott. And he makes the argument that instead of thinking about ourselves as somehow profoundly free, that we're actually in a space that is connected to this idea of emancipation, but not emancipation in a kind of a dictionary sense of the term, but he argues that emancipation is connected to a set of juridical and legislative practices that is an extension of unfreedom, right? That abolition and what he calls the long emancipation or emancipation are different, right? To emancipate, I guess he implies, is to enslave differently, right? Or is to find a different route to stealing the life and labor from the most vulnerable components of a population, right? And following Ruha Benjamin's scholarship, she wrote an article called "Black Afterlives Matter" in the Boston Review in 2018. She says she argues for an expansion of kinfulness, not populations, right? That the work that the prison industrial complex does is that it renders and handles populations, that it breaks the kinship ties, right? Which is what happens when you incarcerate somebody. As I told my students, right? When you incarcerate someone, you're not just caging a human being, right? You're incarcerating or you're caging a family. You're encaging a community, right? That, after all, is most likely hyper surveilled and over policed in the first place, right? Which is what is sort of part of the process that leads to and bolsters hyper incarceration. So anyway, I just wanted to share those things with you. I'll stop there because I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I was real hype about these readings this week. So
yeah, no, I think I want you to speak on it more, but
I can and I will.
Yes. But one of the things I just wanted to comment on was, when we started presenting BBO's work amongst other bond funds, I remember very distinctly someone being like, wow, this is work I do that's totally separate from the work I do at my church, for example. And it's like, they wanted the, how we're thinking about it theologically and everything like that, so that they could sort of spread that out right into their communities as well, right? Because I think people tend to separate the spiritual from the political, right? But actually, you can't, right? And so I think we were articulating something that had resonance for other spiritually inclined people, right? And as Camila is saying, Islam is liberation theology, right? I actually am trying to move away from saying Islamic liberation theology, because Islam is liberation theology.
Right. If you're doing it right.
Absolutely. Right. But yeah, I'd love to hear you sort of speak more on this idea of the emancipation and the unfreedom.
So actually, let me circle back to it, because I think because I want to talk about something very important that in what you said, and about how many of us tend to make the mistake of trying to separate our theology from our politics, right? Which is very dangerous. And essentially, the question that I think we want to ask and then answer at some point is, how can our Muslim communities participate more substantively in matters of social justice, right? And just sort of thinking strategically, I think the question and one of the things that I think that you all are doing masterfully is using charity as an entry point for justice work, rather than societal transformation, right? I mean, that's obviously an outcome that you're pushing for. And here's why I'm saying this, right? I agree with Dr. Bilal Ware's critique of American Muslim communities, or rather American Muslim community behavior.
Say more.
I will say more. He says that our Muslim communities, or rather our Muslim community behavior, is overwhelmingly aligned with capitalist hierarchy. That capitalism, perhaps, is our faith tradition, by virtue of what we do, not necessarily what we say we believe, but what we do, right? And that Islam is the religious expression through which we participate in that, or the expression through which we seek to interface with that, right? Not all of us, but a healthy segment of our population, of our Muslim brothers and sisters, right, really believe the messaging that they're given, right, about people who look like me, for example, right? And so, if I can, I want to read a quote from Break Every Yoke. This is on page 47 for those of you who might already have the book. Anyway, he says, as activist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore characterizes the abolitionist attitude, right? And this is sort of a counterpoint to what I'm identifying. Actually, let me back up, right? Let me back up. On page 39, he says, and this is sort of referring to a political theology of incarceration, right? That brings us to where we are, right? That's happening in the United States, right? So on page 39, we're having class right now. In language that certain religious community or the Calvinists drew from Isaiah 48:10. Calvinists spoke of the prison as a furnace of affliction, one in which God ordained sufferings paved the way for receiving grace and reforming behavior, right? Suffering, they say, was not incidental to the state project of reforming deviance. It was essential and by its own light, benevolent. And so, as historian Jennifer Graber puts it, the, quote, theology of redemptive suffering did not merely allow for degradation and abuse. It demanded these degrading practices, right? And so there's a way in which Muslims in the United States have bought into this political theology, have bought into this idea of a redemptive suffering that surely must take place if you are in prison, not because you're guilty, but because you are imprisoned, right? And so then and now, they say, Americans' civic faith in the power of brutal state violence to affect positive social outcomes is also a religious faith.
Yeah.
Right? This sort of religion of reform is what I'm sort of pointing to through their work. And so I'm going to read more if that's okay, right? Because these are bars. As activist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore characterizes the abolitionist attitude, abolition, she says, is a form of consciousness, a dynamic aimed toward unfinished liberation, requires not inclusion in this system, but the collapse of racial capitalism and the emergence of a new way of being in the world. The racial critique of white supremacy is also an economic critique of capitalism. For Gilmore, racial capitalism does more work than simply diagnosing the central role of slavery in the formation of capitalism in America. Rather, she describes how race thinking has haunted capitalism from the beginning and has shaped the ways that those with power organize vulnerability so as to create sacrificable populations, right? If we are inherently capitalist, we are also racist. If we are capitalist, then we are also racist, right? Because the two are intertwined and you cannot disentangle the two, right? Just like we cannot disentangle our theology from our politics, because to disentangle, or at least to claim to disentangle your theology from your politics, is an expression of one's faith. And it is an expression of one's politics simultaneously, period. Now, this idea of sacrificable populations, in my mind, seems to resonate quite deeply with the call for transformation inherent in the notion of building what Ruha Benjamin calls kinfulness, right? And not populations. That is to highlight what makes us human, right? In a qualitative fashion, not a quantitative fashion, right? And so Islam, as you mentioned before, right? One of the ways that we might think of Islamic liberation, right, as somehow redundant is because Islam is inherently liberational in what it claims to be, right? It invites us to liberate ourselves and others, right? And so we have to think of Islam as a counterpoint to ethno-nationalism, as a counterpoint to white supremacy, right? We have to think of social justice as a maqasid in Islam. That is a higher objective, right? Why are we Muslim? Is a question, right? If we're not actively being Muslim, right? Not in sort of terms of like capital M, this is my identity, but being Muslim, not a Muslim, but Muslim, right?
Submitting.
In terms of, yes, in terms of how you engage the world, right? Then we're doing something wrong. That we have, I don't know what Qur'an some of us are reading, but if we're reading it all, side issue. But I'm trying not to be shady, I'm sorry, it's Ramadan. But in a racial capitalist context, and in response to imperialist colonialist trajectories of modern Euro nation states, Islam operates inherently as a decolonial theological intervention. A decolonial theological intervention, right? This is what Islam does at its outset. As soon as it touches the lips of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? As soon as it touches those blessed lips, right? It is aimed at the status quo. It is aimed at an economic, political hierarchy that renders some hopelessly impoverished and vulnerable, right? Due to no fault of their own. I have a baby walking. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. Go to the store, sweetie. Yeah, it's inherently decolonial. It's an intervention that renders us free by our very utterance of the shahada, for example, right? The purpose of prisons, and stop me whenever you want me to shut up.
No,
but the purpose of prisons is not societal reentry, but rather for expansive and ready access to cheap, disempowered labor, right? Wage slaves, wage slavery. That is the purpose of imprisonment in this country. And so might we not recognize that certain calls for the freeing of enslaved people, as you alluded to earlier, might be contemporarily applied to the disenfranchised in our society as we understand them now. And so it seems that our Islamic legal tradition might be more forcefully inspired by a radical imagination, by our radical imagination, and a higher moral vision that considers intention and outcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to think about what kind of world we want to leave for our children and grandchildren, right? I think the task of a Muslim is to worship God, obviously, and in so doing so, aim to leave this world better than how they found it, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop there because I've been talking a lot, but
well, you know, I'm a teacher too, and I don't get enough opportunities to just have someone teach me in this way, so I'm loving it. So this actually reminds me of more verses, right? Especially what you were talking about in terms of, you know, what Quran are people reading? What do they mean when they call themselves Muslim, right? And, you know, this is from Baqarah. It's like, you know, first pages, your first day of Quran reading. You don't even have to go very far, right? Some people say, this is verse 8 from Baqarah. Some people say we believe in God in the last day, when really they do not believe. They seek to deceive God and the believers, but they only deceive themselves, though they do not realize it. There is a disease in their hearts, which God has added to. Agonizing torment awaits them for their persistent lying. When it is said to them, do not cause corruption in the land, they say, we are only putting things right. But really they are causing corruption, though they do not realize it. You know, and this putting things right, you know, it can be translated as reform, right? And this when I read this, I was very stunned, right, in terms of how do people understand what the actual corruption of our society is, right? And then also what's happening to our hearts. And this is something I think a lot about, and I'm really, I think this is part of our project, right? In this generation, in terms of acknowledging, right, the racial capitalism that we live in. And I think it's Dr. Bilal Ware and yourself, Dr. Carter, are really getting at this aspect of like, is Islam the modality through which we are, living our capitalist lives, right? And if that is so, right, like that's a problem, right? And we have to ask ourselves about our conditions of our hearts, right? How hardened have they become to the society that we live in, right? So that we can't see, we can't hear, we don't recognize, we don't feel something, right? When you hear these stories of injustice, right? I mean, it's something that, I feel like we all have to reckon with, right? Constantly. And I think that's part of the work that we're doing. And also Ramadan, again, it's another part of the infrastructure of Islam, right? It is that time that we really try to slow down and do that reflection and return to the Qur'an year after year. I was writing, in the book that I'm writing right now, I'm trying to speak both to my Muslim kin, but also to my non-Muslim kin, right? And especially a lot of those folks who, have kind of put religion out of their lives, right? Or organized religion out of their lives. And I say that, Muslims have something to offer the world, right? In terms of, our survival, in terms of in terms of the survival, especially of the prison system, right? The way that Muslims come out thriving from the worst conditions, the ways that Muslims are able to maintain their humanity in face of war and occupation. And then also just the fact that 1,400 years of producing a huge population that has memorized this book, right? Like when you think about it, subhanAllah, right? I think we have something to offer. And I think a lot of people don't recognize, they're shy about that offering. There's some shame too, right? About what we actually have to offer society. And like to actually embrace that fully, right?
No, indeed. I mean, I think one of the fundamental questions is, do the Muslim communities that we consider ourselves a part of, like actually and profoundly and fundamentally consider incarcerated Muslims as a part of those communities, right? I don't know. I mean, I think that's a question that we have to sort of answer at another time. But yeah, I mean, we should stop here because it's time to break fast and make Maghrib. But I want to hold up the work that Believers Bail Out is doing, and I want to close with the dua whenever we're ready.
Yeah, please.
Inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. God, give us the courage to live our lives in a righteous manner, to walk this faith faithfully, to advocate for the good earnestly, and to prohibit evil forcefully. Allah, make us not of the hypocrites. Make us of those who are pleasing in your sight. Ya Allah, keep us in your guidance and mercy and your favor and protection. ربنا أتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. وربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد سابق لوامه أنوارهم من السماوات صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه عدد الرماد وعدد نجوم السماء. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Believers Bail Out, for doing the work that you do. I mean,
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter, for joining us. And we might have to have you bring in a real reading rainbow book club action.
I'm happy. I'm happy to.
Ramadan, we'll get our reading group started up again. So, inshallah.
Inshallah.
So, assalamu alaikum. Oh, you're muted, Camila.
Oops, my bad. I was vibing so hard, I didn't realize I was not talking. Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair, everyone, for joining us, for the conversation, for the bars dropped. We appreciate it. Inshallah. Make sure to join us next week for our final session of Dua and Chill. Check out the Launch Good page and donate, inshallah, and get some of these blessings. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.